The Vietnam War was so poorly planned. Now, the big event everyone talks about is the Gulf of Tonkin incident. However, there was lead up for a decade before that. Following the independence of Vietnam as both a North and a South Vietnam, Eisenhower started giving some military aid as well as support via military trainers to the Army of South Vietnam. But then Kennedy massively increased the amount of military personnel that were going there to train and assist the military of South Vietnam. But they weren't engaging in ground operations at that point. Now, both Eisenhower and MacArthur, as well as a lot of the other military experts and generals who had been fighting in all of the different wars, were like, don't get in this. What's the purpose of getting involved in South Vietnam? How do you prove that there's going to be an end to the war? But then in comes LBJ, and he decides he wants to go to war in Vietnam. But then while he's doing that, it's such a terrible job. He starts Operation Rolling Thunder, but the rules of engagement for the pilots was so poorly done that there was no possibility that they were going to achieve their outcomes. Plus, it later came out that LBJ was actually directly sending messages to the North Vietnamese to let them know what bombing targets were going to be hit, because he didn't want the Russians, who are also assisting the North Vietnamese, to get caught up in the explosions, thus possibly starting World War III. But the problem is that by telling your enemy where you're going to hit, that just means that they're going to move a whole bunch of forces in and be able to attack your people. Further, despite getting into the Gulf of Tonkin, at no point did he drop sea mines into the different ports in North Vietnam. Now, Nixon would later do this because it's a really important thing, because the Chinese and the Soviets were moving in a lot of material into the ports of North Vietnam. And so by blocking off those harbors, by mining them, it severely hampered the North Vietnamese ability to wage war on the South. Plus, with the North Vietnamese invading the South as well as other countries, they were breaking sovereignty laws, meaning that by international law, the South could invade North Vietnam, and the United States at no point did that. A big part of this was they were worried that if they did that, the Chinese would come in like they did in the Korean War. However, the Chinese military of 1965 was not the Chinese military of 1950. Further, LBJ just started dumping troops after troops into Vietnam, instead of training up the South Vietnamese forces, which would have made way more sense, which Nixon later would do in Vietnamization, and then be able to get the American troops out, as well as sign a peace treaty, which the North held to for a couple years until the United States was fully out of South Vietnam in 1975, when they finally reinvaded.